The night Zhao Wei dragged his 18-year-old daughter from her bed and bartered her life for horses and silver, Maylene understood that shame weighs more than love in a father's heart. Bound and terrified in the back of a stranger's wagon, she believed she knew exactly what awaited her. Another cage, another master, another life where her existence meant nothing. But across the windswept plains of Wyoming territory, a widowed rancher named Caleb Hawthorne had made an unusual request. He wanted the Chinese girl everyone else called worthless. What he saw in her would change everything. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Maylene's story travels. And if her journey moves you, hit that like button and stay until the end. The smell hit Maylene first, leather and unwashed wool, mixed with the acrid tang of her own fear. She lay curled in the corner of the merchant's wagon, wrist bound with rough hemp that had already rubbed her skin raw. Through the gap in the canvas covering, she could see stars she didn't recognize scattered across a sky too vast to comprehend. Everything had happened so quickly. One moment she'd been sleeping on her thin pallet in the storage room behind her father's shop in Prospect Creek. The next, rough hands had yanked her upright, and her father's voice, cold, final, had cut through her confusion like a blade. "You cost me everything," he'd said in Cantonese, not even looking at her face. "Your mother died bringing shame into this world. At least now you'll be worth something." She'd seen the merchant then, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained teeth, counting coins into her father's palm. Behind him, 2 horses stood tied to the hitching post, and several sacks of flour sat stacked in the street. The price of a daughter's life. Maylene had tried to speak, to beg, to ask where they were taking her, but her father had simply turned his back and walked into his shop, closing the door with a finality that echoed in her chest. Now 3 days into the journey, she still didn't know her destination. The merchant, a man called Dwight, who spoke no Chinese and seemed to assume she understood no English, had said nothing to her beyond barked orders to eat, to relieve herself quickly when they stopped, to stay quiet. She understood more English than people assumed. Her mother had insisted on it, whispering lessons to her daughter in the dark, teaching her to navigate a world that would never fully accept them. "Listen more than you speak," her mother had said, her gentle hands braiding Maylene's hair. "They will underestimate you. Let them." Understanding without revealing understanding, that is power. The memory brought tears that Maylene refused to let fall. Crying changed nothing. It never had. The wagon lurched over a deep rut, and Maylene's shoulder slammed against the wooden side. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Dwight had made it clear he had no patience for complaints. Through the canvas, she could hear him talking to someone. Another voice, younger, asking questions. "How much farther to Hawthorne Ranch?" the young voice asked. 2 days if the weather holds," Dwight replied. 3 if it don't." "Mr. Hawthorne really paid that much for a Chinese girl? My pa says they're bad luck." "Your pa's an ignorant fool then." Dwight spat, and Maylene heard the wet sound of tobacco hitting dirt. Caleb Hawthorne ain't the kind of man who does anything without good reason. If he wanted this particular girl, then he had his reasons. Ain't my business to question a man who pays in advance and pays well? Maylene's breath caught. They were talking about her as if she were livestock being delivered. But one detail snagged her attention. This particular girl. Not just any Chinese girl. Her specifically. Why? The question terrified her more than she wanted to admit. In her 18 years, she'd learned that being noticed was dangerous. Being wanted was worse. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, but the memory had started to blur around the edges. It had been 4 years since the fever took her, 4 years of living with a father who looked at her with nothing but bitter resentment. Zhao Wei had never been a warm man, but after her mother's death, something in him had calcified into pure hatred. Maylene represented everything he'd lost. His wife, his homeland, his dignity in a country that treated Chinese laborers as less than human. In Prospect Creek, the few Chinese families kept to themselves, running laundries and small shops, speaking their own language, maintaining their own traditions. But even among her own people, Maylene had been isolated. Her father refused visitors, turned away the other family's attempts at friendship, built walls around his grief and his daughter, until she might as well have been invisible. She'd learned to move through the world like a ghost, silent, unseen, expecting nothing, and now someone had paid to make her visible again. The thought made her stomach turn. The wagon stopped just after dawn on the 5th day. Maylene had been drifting in and out of exhausted sleep, her body aching from days of being jostled over rough terrain. When Dwight pulled back the canvas, the sudden brightness made her squint. "Get out," he said, not unkindly. "Stretch your legs. We're stopping for a few hours." Her bound hands made climbing down difficult, but she managed, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit solid ground. They were in a small hollow surrounded by pine trees, a creek running clear and cold nearby. Dwight untied her wrists, and Maylene tried not to gasp at the relief. The skin beneath the rope had rubbed raw, weeping in places. "Go clean yourself up in the creek," Dwight said, gesturing toward the water. "You got 10 minutes. Don't think about running. There's nothing but wilderness for miles, and you wouldn't last a day on your own." Maylene nodded, not trusting her voice. She walked to the creek on unsteady legs, her entire body protesting the movement. When she reached the water's edge, she knelt and plunged her hands in, hissing at the cold. The water ran red for a moment as it washed the dried blood from her wrists. She splashed her face, scrubbed the back of her neck, tried to work the dust from her hair with wet fingers. She could run. Dwight was right that she probably wouldn't survive, but dying in the wilderness might be better than whatever awaited her at this ranch. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. Her mother hadn't taught her English, hadn't shared her knowledge of herbs and healing, hadn't whispered stories of strength and survival just for Maylene to give up before she even understood what she was facing. Understanding before action, her mother had always said. Watch, listen, then decide. So Maylene would watch. She would listen. And when the time came, she would decide her own fate. They reached Hawthorne Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun hung low and golden over the valley. Maylene had her first glimpse of it as the wagon crested a rise, a sprawling operation nestled between rolling hills, with a main house built of honey-colored wood, several barns, corrals filled with horses, and smaller buildings scattered across the property. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Bound. People moved between buildings, ranch hands going about their work, children playing near one of the barns. It looked almost peaceful. The contradiction terrified her. As the wagon descended into the valley, Maylene's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself into the corner, trying to make herself smaller, invisible again. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, and Dwight set the brake with a grunt. "Wait here," he told her, then climbed down and walked toward the porch where a man stood waiting. Maylene studied him through the gap in the canvas. He was tall, she could tell that even from a distance, with broad shoulders and dark hair that needed cutting. He wore simple ranch clothes, work pants, a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, boots that had seen hard use. His age was difficult to determine from this distance, but something in the way he stood suggested a man who'd lived long enough to understand both hardship and responsibility. This was Caleb Hawthorne, the man who'd bought her. Maylene watched as Dwight and Caleb spoke, their voices too low for her to hear clearly. Dwight gestured toward the wagon. Caleb nodded, handed over what looked like a leather pouch, payment, presumably, and then started walking toward her. Every instinct screamed at Maylene to run, to hide, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. So she stayed frozen in her corner, barely breathing, as Caleb Hawthorne approached the back of the wagon. He stopped a few feet away and pulled the canvas aside fully. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Up close, Maylene could see he was maybe 35, with sun-weathered skin and gray eyes that held an unexpected gentleness. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, and his hands, large, calloused, rested calmly at his sides. "Hello," he said quietly. "My name is Caleb Hawthorne. I know you're frightened. I know this wasn't your choice, but I want you to know that you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." Maylene said nothing. She'd heard promises before. They meant nothing. Caleb seemed to understand her silence. He took a small step back, giving her more space. "I'm going to help you down from the wagon," he said. "Then I'll show you to your room. You must be exhausted from the journey." Your room. The words didn't make sense. Servants didn't have rooms. Property didn't have rooms. Caleb extended his hand, palm up, waiting. Maylene stared at that hand for a long moment. It was a working hand, scarred and strong, but there was no threat in the gesture, just an offer. Slowly, she uncurled from her corner and moved toward the back of the wagon. She ignored his outstretched hand. Touching him felt like accepting something she didn't understand yet, and climbed down on her own, though her legs nearly gave out when she landed. Caleb stepped back immediately, maintaining distance. "Can you walk?" he asked. Maylene nodded, not trusting her voice. "This way, then." He led her toward the house, and Maylene followed several steps behind, her eyes taking in everything. The ranch hands who'd stopped to watch quickly returned to their work when Caleb glanced their way. A woman emerged from one of the smaller buildings, middle-aged, with kind eyes and flour on her apron, but Caleb shook his head slightly, and she nodded, understanding the silent message to wait. The main house was larger than Maylene had expected, built sturdy and well-maintained. Caleb held the door open for her, and she stepped inside, her senses immediately overwhelmed. Clean. The place smelled clean, wood smoke and pine soap and something baking. The main room held comfortable furniture, well-worn but cared for. Books lined shelves on one wall. A stone fireplace dominated another. Through a doorway, she could see a kitchen, and beyond that, what looked like a dining room. Nothing about this place suggested cruelty, which meant nothing. Maylene had learned early that monsters often wore the most pleasant masks. "Your room is upstairs," Caleb said, gesturing toward a staircase. "Second door on the left. There's a wash basin and clean water. I'll have Sarah, she's the woman you saw outside, bring you some food and fresh clothes. The door has a lock on the inside. You can use it if it makes you feel safer." Maylene's head snapped up at that. A lock. On the inside. Caleb met her eyes steadily. "I meant what I said. You're safe here. Take the time you need to rest. When you're ready, we'll talk." He turned and walked back toward the front door, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room. Maylene didn't move for a full minute after he left. She just stood there, trying to understand what was happening, trying to identify the trap, because there had to be a trap. Men didn't buy women and then give them locked rooms and promises of safety. Did they? Finally, legs shaking, she climbed the stairs and found the second door on the left. She pushed it open cautiously. The room was small but immaculate. A real bed, not a pallet on the floor, but an actual bed with a quilt and pillows. A washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, a chair by the window, a small wardrobe, and on the inside of the door a simple iron lock. Maylene closed the door and turned the lock with trembling fingers. The click of the bolt sliding home felt impossibly loud in the quiet room. Then finally alone and finally safe enough to let herself feel, Maylene Zhao sank to the floor and allowed herself to cry for the first time in years. She must have fallen asleep on the floor because the next thing Maylene knew, the light had changed. Softer now, evening settling over the valley. Her body ached everywhere and her face felt swollen from crying. A soft knock on the door made her jerk upright. "Miss?" A woman's voice, gentle and uncertain. "I'm Sarah. Mr. Hawthorne asked me to bring you some things. I'm going to leave them outside the door. Take your time." Maylene heard footsteps retreating, then silence. She waited a full 5 minutes before unlocking the door and opening it cautiously. On the floor outside sat a tray covered with a cloth, a bundle of folded clothing, and a pair of soft boots. No one waited in the hallway. Maylene grabbed everything quickly and locked the door again. The tray held warm soup, fresh bread, cheese, and sliced apples. The smell alone made her stomach clench with hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten properly. She sat on the floor again. The bed still felt too presumptuous, and ate slowly, making herself take small bites even though she wanted to devour everything. The soup was rich and savory, the bread still warm from the oven. When she'd finished eating, she examined the clothes. A simple cotton dress in deep blue, well-made and practical. Undergarments. The boots were butter-soft leather, clearly broken in but clean and well-maintained. Someone else's clothes, someone else's life, but they fit when she tried them on, and they were infinitely more comfortable than the dirty, torn clothing she'd been wearing. Maylene moved to the window and looked out over the ranch. The sun had set fully now, and lights glowed in windows across the property. She could see figures moving between buildings, hear distant voices and laughter. The scene looked so normal, so peaceful. She didn't trust it, but she also couldn't deny the evidence of her own senses. She'd been given a room, a lock, food, and clothing. No one had hurt her. No one had even touched her beyond Caleb's brief, respectful offer of assistance from the wagon. Watch, listen, then decide. her mother's voice, clear as if she stood beside Maylene in the darkening room. So that's what Maylene would do. She would watch this place, these people. She would listen to what they said and what they didn't say. And when she understood what was really happening here, she would decide what to do next. She was done being sold, being moved, being treated as something less than human. Whatever happened next, it would be her choice. Morning came too early, sunlight streaming through the window and pulling Maylene from dreams she couldn't remember. For a moment she forgot where she was, then memory crashed back and she sat up quickly, disoriented. The bed. She'd eventually moved to the bed sometime in the night, too exhausted to maintain her vigil on the floor. Another knock on the door. "Miss, it's Sarah again. I've brought breakfast and fresh water for washing. I'll leave it out here." The same routine as last night. Maylene waited until the footsteps receded, then retrieved the tray. This time there were eggs, bacon, and what looked like fried potatoes. The pitcher held steaming water that smelled faintly of lavender. She ate, washed, and dressed in the same blue dress from yesterday, her only option. Then she sat in the chair by the window and watched the ranch come to life below. Workers emerged from the bunkhouse, heading toward the barns. The woman Sarah moved between buildings, purposeful and efficient. Children appeared, 3 of them, ranging in age from maybe 5 to 10, and began what looked like chores, feeding chickens and collecting eggs. And Caleb Hawthorne. Maylene spotted him by the main barn, working alongside his hands to move hay bales. He didn't stand apart like a lord overseeing servants. He worked with them, his shirt already dark with sweat despite the early hour. Maylene watched him for a long time, trying to understand. Around mid-morning, another knock. "Miss?" Sarah's voice again, but different this time, less formal, warmer. "Mr. Hawthorne was hoping you might join him for lunch, just the 2 of you, at the house. He thought it might be easier to talk without an audience. But if you're not ready, that's fine too. No pressure." Maylene's first instinct was to refuse, to stay locked in this room where nothing could touch her. But hiding accomplished nothing, and she still didn't understand what was happening here, what Caleb Hawthorne wanted, why he'd specifically asked for her. She needed answers. "I'll come," she said quietly, her voice rusty from disuse. A pause, then, "Wonderful. Noon in the dining room. I'll make something nice." Maylene descended the stairs at precisely noon, her heart hammering. The main room was empty, but she could hear sounds from the kitchen, Sarah humming while she worked. "In here, dear," Sarah called out, and Maylene followed the voice. The dining room held a simple wooden table set for 2. Caleb sat at one end, looking almost as nervous as Maylene felt. He stood when she entered. "Thank you for joining me," he said. "Please sit wherever you're comfortable." Maylene chose the chair farthest from him and sat rigidly, her hands clasped in her lap. Sarah appeared with plates of food, roasted chicken, vegetables, bread, and set them down with an encouraging smile before disappearing back into the kitchen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb seemed to be gathering his thoughts, and Maylene simply waited, her defenses up. Finally, Caleb set down his fork and looked at her directly. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "I know how this must look to you. I know what your father told you, what the merchant probably implied. And I know that nothing I say will immediately make you trust me. But I'm going to tell you the truth anyway, because you deserve at least that." Maylene said nothing, but she was listening. "6 months ago, I lost my wife," Caleb continued, his voice steady but pained. "Fever took her quickly. We'd been married 8 years. She was everything. When she died, it felt like the whole valley lost its color." He paused, took a breath. The ranch kept running because it had to. The hands needed work, the cattle needed tending, the horses needed training. But I was just going through the motions. I stopped seeing the point of any of it. Then, about 2 months ago, I had business in Prospect Creek. I was walking past your father's shop and I saw you through the window. Maylene's breath caught. She remembered that day. Her father had sent her to clean the front window, and she'd been kneeling on the floor, scrubbing, when a shadow had fallen across the glass. "You were working," Caleb said. "Cleaning, I think. Your father was yelling at you. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. And you just kept working. Your face was blank, but your hands were shaking." He stopped, seemed to struggle with how to continue. I saw someone who understood loss, he finally said. Someone who'd learned to keep moving even when everything inside was broken. Someone who was surviving despite everything working against her. And I thought maybe we could survive together. Not because either of us was weak, but because we both understood what it meant to keep going when everything else has fallen apart. Maylene found her voice, though it came out harsh. So you bought me, like livestock. Yes. Caleb didn't flinch from the accusation. I did, and I'm not going to pretend that was noble or right. I knew your father would sell you if someone offered enough. I knew that, and I used it because I thought I could offer you something better than what you had. You don't know what I had. You're right, I don't. But I know what you didn't have. You didn't have freedom. You didn't have safety. You didn't have anyone who saw you as more than a burden or a shame. The words hit too close, and Maylene felt her carefully constructed walls start to crack. What do you want from me? She asked, and hated how vulnerable she sounded. Nothing you're not willing to give, Caleb said immediately. You're not my property, Maylene. You're not my servant. You're a person who deserves to decide her own future. I brought you here because I thought maybe, this could be a place where you could build a life that was yours. And if I want to leave, then I'll give you money and supplies, and I'll take you wherever you want to go. Maylene searched his face for deception, for the catch, for the trap, but all she saw was a man carrying his own grief, trying to do something that might be either profoundly compassionate or deeply foolish. I don't understand you, she said finally. I don't entirely understand myself, Caleb admitted with a small, sad smile. But I'm trying to do something right in a world that's mostly been wrong. Maybe that's enough to start with. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Maylene surprised herself by picking up her fork and taking a bite of chicken. It was the best meal she'd had in 4 years. The days that followed developed a cautious rhythm. Maylene kept her door locked at night, but began venturing out during the day. She explored the ranch, always staying within sight of the main house at first, watching how people interacted, listening to conversations, learning the patterns of this strange new place. Sarah turned out to be Caleb's sister-in-law, his late wife's sister, who'd come to help run the household after her sister's death. She had 3 children, Matthew, 10 years old and serious, Rebecca, 8 and curious about everything, and little Thomas, just 5, who seemed to collect bruises and scrapes like other children collected rocks. You don't have to hide in your room, Sarah told Maylene one morning, her hands deep in bread dough. You're welcome anywhere on this ranch. The children have been asking about you. They're curious about the pretty lady who came from far away. Maylene didn't feel pretty. She felt foreign and fragile and uncertain, but she also felt something she hadn't expected, interested. The ranch itself fascinated her. It was a complete world, self-contained and efficient. The cattle provided meat and leather. The horses were bred and trained for sale. Gardens produced vegetables. Chickens provided eggs. Everyone had a role, and everyone seemed to understand how their work contributed to the whole. It reminded her of something her mother had said once. A community is like a body. Every part matters. Every part has purpose. In Prospect Creek, Maylene had been purposeless. Here, she was beginning to see possibilities. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, little Thomas came running into the yard screaming. Blood poured from a gash on his forehead, where he'd apparently run into a fence post. Sarah scooped him up, trying to calm him while pressing a cloth to the wound. Matthew had run to fetch Caleb, and Rebecca stood frozen, her face pale with fear. Maylene found herself moving before she'd made a conscious decision. Let me see, she said, approaching Sarah. Sarah looked uncertain, but Thomas's cries were getting weaker, and the blood wasn't stopping. She nodded. Maylene examined the wound quickly. Deep but clean, not life-threatening if treated properly. She turned to Rebecca. I need clean water, boiled if possible. I need clean cloth for bandages. And I need... She paused, trying to remember the English words. Cobwebs. Fresh cobwebs from somewhere dark and dry. Rebecca stared at her. Now, Maylene said firmly, and something in her tone made Rebecca run. Maylene took Thomas from Sarah and carried him into the house, speaking softly to him in Cantonese, words he wouldn't understand but that seemed to calm him anyway. She cleaned the wound with the boiled water Rebecca brought, then carefully applied the cobwebs to stop the bleeding, a technique her mother had taught her. The silk helps blood clot, she explained to Sarah's wide-eyed stare. Old knowledge works better than plain cloth alone. She wrapped Thomas's head with clean bandages, her fingers steady and sure. This at least she knew how to do. Her mother had been a healer in their village in China, and she'd passed that knowledge to her daughter like a sacred gift. Caleb arrived just as Maylene was finishing, his face tight with worry. But when he saw Thomas, bandaged and already looking better, the bleeding stopped. He released a breath he'd been holding. The wound is clean, Maylene said. He'll heal, but watch for fever. If he develops a fever, I'll need different herbs. You did this? Caleb asked, looking at the neat bandaging, the calm child who'd been screaming moments before. My mother taught me, Maylene said simply. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Thank you, he said quietly. Sarah, this boy's been trying to split his head open since he learned to walk. Looks like we finally have someone who knows how to put him back together. Sarah hugged Maylene impulsively, surprising them both. You saved him, she whispered. He could have bled to death. He wasn't going to die, Maylene said, uncomfortable with the praise. It was just a cut. But later, when word spread through the ranch about what had happened, Maylene noticed the ranch hands looking at her differently. Not with suspicion or dismissal, but with something closer to respect. She'd done something useful. She'd contributed. And for the first time since arriving at Hawthorne Ranch, Maylene began to feel like maybe she could belong here. Not as property, not as a burden, but as someone with skills, with knowledge, with value that had nothing to do with what she cost or who had sold her. For a girl who'd been told her entire life that she was worthless, that realization felt like the first breath after drowning. Thomas's cut healed cleanly over the next week, leaving barely a scar. But the impact of that afternoon rippled through the ranch in ways Maylene hadn't anticipated. 2 days after treating Thomas, one of the ranch hands, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd worked cattle for 30 years, knocked on the kitchen door while Maylene was helping Sarah prepare supper. Begging your pardon, ma'am, he said, his hat clutched awkwardly in his weathered hands. But my shoulder's been giving me trouble, something fierce. Can't lift my arm above my head no more. Doc in town just wants to bleed me, but I seen what you did for the boy. Thought maybe... He trailed off, looking embarrassed. Maylene glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragement. Show me, Maylene said. Pete removed his shirt carefully, wincing with each movement. Maylene examined his shoulder, her fingers probing gently. The joint was inflamed, hot to the touch, and the muscles around it had knotted tight, trying to compensate for the injury. How did this happen? She asked. Horse threw me about 3 weeks back, landed hard on my side. Thought it would work itself out, but it just keeps getting worse. Maylene nodded slowly. I need to make a poultice. It will smell bad, but it will draw out the inflammation. And I'll show you movements to do, gentle ones, to keep the joint from freezing completely. Whatever you think is best, ma'am. She spent the next hour gathering what she needed from the sparse supplies available. No proper Chinese herbs here, but the land offered its own medicine if you knew where to look. Willow bark for the pain, comfrey for the inflammation. She ground them together with animal fat to make a thick paste, wrapped it in clean cloth, and applied it to Pete's shoulder. Keep this on overnight, she instructed. Tomorrow, remove it and do the movements I showed you, 3 times a day. Come see me in 3 days. Pete left looking skeptical but hopeful. 3 days later, he returned grinning, able to lift his arm over his head for the first time in weeks. Damned if it don't work, he said, then immediately apologized for the language. Sorry, ma'am, but you got some kind of magic in those hands. Not magic, Maylene corrected quietly. Just old knowledge. But word spread. By the end of the 2nd week, ranch hands were finding excuses to seek her out. A persistent cough, a twisted ankle that wouldn't heal right, stomach troubles that had plagued a man for months. Maylene treated each one with the remedies her mother had taught her, adapting what she knew to the materials available in this new land. She discovered that the valley offered unexpected treasures. Sage grew wild on the hillsides, different from the Chinese varieties she'd known, but potent for clearing lung congestion. Wild mint thrived near the creek, perfect for digestive ailments. Pine resin could be harvested and used for drawing out infections. The land spoke to her in a language she understood, even if nothing else about this place made sense yet. Sarah watched these developments with undisguised approval. "You're making yourself indispensable," she said one evening as they worked together in the kitchen. "That's smart." "I'm not trying to be smart," Maylene replied, chopping vegetables with precise economical movements. "I'm just doing what I know how to do." "That's even smarter." Sarah paused in her kneading, flour dusting her forearms. "You know, when Caleb first told me he was bringing you here, I thought he'd lost his mind. No offense intended. None taken. But I'm starting to see what he saw in town that day. You're a survivor, Maylene. This ranch needs people who know how to survive." Maylene didn't respond, but the words settled somewhere deep in her chest, warm and unexpected. That evening, Caleb invited her to walk with him after supper. It had become something of a routine over the past weeks, slow walks around the property as the sun set, conversations that started cautious and gradually became easier. They walked toward the creek, the same one where Maylene had washed the blood from her wrists that first morning. It felt like a lifetime ago now. "Sarah tells me you've been working miracles," Caleb said, his hands in his pockets, his stride matching hers. "Not miracles, medicine. The men are calling you the healer. Pete won't stop talking about his shoulder. Says you fixed in 3 days what the town doctor couldn't fix in 3 weeks. Maylene shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "The town doctor doesn't know what I know." They reached the creek and stood watching the water flow over smooth stones, catching the last golden light of day. "My mother was a healer," Maylene said suddenly, surprising herself. She rarely spoke about her mother, especially not to Caleb. "In our village in China, people would come from far away to see her. She could cure fevers, mend broken bones, help women through difficult births. She knew which plants to use for which ailments, which combinations worked together, which ones would kill you if you got the dose wrong." "She taught you all of that?" "Everything she could. She said knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you. Property could be stolen, money could be lost, even people could leave you. But what you learned, what you truly understood, that was yours forever." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was." Maylene's throat tightened. "My father blamed her for not being a son, blamed her for choosing to marry him and leave China, blamed her for dying and leaving him alone in a foreign land with a daughter he never wanted. But she was the strongest person I ever knew." "I think her daughter might be just as strong." Maylene glanced at him sharply, looking for mockery or manipulation, but his face showed only sincerity. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Maybe not, but I'm learning." They stood in comfortable silence as the sky deepened from gold to purple to the first dark blue of evening. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. Closer, the creek continued its endless conversation with the stones. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said finally. "You can ask. I may not answer." "Fair enough." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Are you happy here? Or at least, less unhappy than you were?" The question caught Maylene off guard. No one had ever asked her about her happiness before. It had never been a consideration. "I don't know if I understand happiness," she said slowly. "But I understand useful. I understand purpose. Here, I have both of those things. That's more than I had before." "That's not the same as happy." "No, but it's a start." Caleb nodded, seeming to accept this. "If there's anything you need, anything that would make this place feel more like home—" "This isn't my home," Maylene interrupted, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "This is a place where I'm allowed to exist. That's different." "It could be your home," Caleb said quietly, "if you wanted it to be." Maylene looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in weeks. She saw a man carrying his own grief, yes, but also a man trying genuinely to offer something good in a world that had been hard to both of them. She saw kindness in his eyes, and patience, and a loneliness that mirrored her own. It terrified her. "I should get back," she said abruptly. "Sarah will wonder where I am." Caleb didn't argue, just walked beside her back to the house in silence. But as they reached the porch, he spoke again. "I meant what I said that first day, Maylene. You're not my property. You're free to leave whenever you choose, but I hope you'll choose to stay." She didn't answer, just slipped inside and climbed the stairs to her room, locking the door behind her out of habit more than fear now. Later, Lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Maylene allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to call this place home. To belong somewhere not because she'd been sold or because she was tolerated, but because she'd chosen it. The thought was more frightening than anything else that had happened since she arrived. The next morning brought a crisis that pushed all such philosophical concerns aside. Little Thomas woke with a fever. Maylene heard Sarah's worried voice from downstairs and descended quickly to find the boy listless and burning hot, his breathing labored and his eyes glassy. "It came on so sudden," Sarah said, her voice tight with panic. "He was fine when he went to bed. I woke him for breakfast and found him like this." Maylene pressed her hand to Thomas's forehead, far too hot. She listened to his chest, hearing the rattle and wheeze of fluid in his lungs. "Lung fever," she said grimly. "How long has he been coughing?" "A few days, but I thought it was just a cold. All the children get colds. This is more than a cold." Rebecca and Matthew stood in the doorway, their faces pale with fear. They'd lost their aunt, Caleb's wife, to fever. Now they were watching their brother burn with the same illness. Caleb appeared, having been summoned from the barn. He took one look at Thomas and his jaw tightened. "I'll ride to town for the doctor," he said. "The doctor will bleed him," Maylene said sharply. "Bleeding weakens. This boy needs strength." "Then what do we do?" Maylene met his eyes. "You trust me, completely, and you let me work." The room fell silent. Sarah looked between Maylene and Caleb, her arms wrapped around her sick son. "Please," Sarah whispered, "please help him." Maylene turned to Caleb. "I need a clear workspace. I need boiling water, lots of it. I need every piece of clean cloth in this house. And I need quiet. No one interrupts me unless I ask for something." "Done," Caleb said immediately. "Matthew, Rebecca, go help gather the cloths. Sarah, you're with me in the kitchen getting water boiling. Maylene has this room." They scattered, and Maylene was left alone with the feverish child. She worked quickly, her mother's training flowing through her hands like muscle memory. First, she stripped Thomas down and bathed him in cool water to bring down the fever. Not cold, that would shock his small body, but cool enough to offer relief. While the water boiled, she mentally cataloged what she had available. The fever needed to be controlled. The lung congestion needed to be broken up and expelled. The boy's strength needed to be maintained so his body could fight. She sent Matthew running to gather fresh pine needles and the last of her carefully hoarded willow bark. She had Sarah crush garlic, not traditional Chinese medicine, but effective nonetheless. She combined these with steam, creating a tent over Thomas's head so he could breathe the medicated vapors directly into his struggling lungs. Every hour, she checked his temperature, adjusted the treatments, forced small sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Sarah stayed nearby, hovering anxiously, occasionally asking questions that Maylene answered in clipped, distracted tones. Her focus belonged entirely to the boy. Caleb checked in periodically but mostly stayed out of the way, his face drawn with worry. He'd already lost his wife to fever. Maylene could see in his eyes the fear that he might lose his nephew too. "He's strong," Maylene told Caleb during one of these check-ins, "and we caught it early, but the next 24 hours will tell the story." "What are his chances?" Maylene could have lied, could have offered false comfort. Instead, she gave him the truth. "Better than they were this morning, but still uncertain." Caleb nodded, appreciating the honesty, even though it clearly pained him. Night fell, and Maylene didn't leave Thomas's side. She dozed in the chair beside his bed, waking every hour to check his condition, to adjust the steam tent, to coax more medicine into him. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Sarah brought her tea and bread. "You should rest," Sarah said softly. "I can watch him for a while." "You don't know what to watch for," Maylene replied, not unkindly. "The fever will try to spike again before dawn. If it does, I need to be ready." Sarah sat down on the floor beside Maylene's chair. "I'm staying anyway. You shouldn't be alone." They sat together in the quiet darkness, listening to Thomas's labored breathing, waiting for dawn. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked after a long silence. "You barely know us. You don't owe us anything. Yet you're sitting here in the middle of the night fighting for my son's life." Maylene considered the question. "When I was 12, she said finally, there was a fever outbreak in our village in China. My mother worked for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, treating everyone who came to our door. I asked her why she didn't turn some of them away, why she didn't rest. She told me that a healer who chooses which lives to save isn't a healer, they're just someone playing at being one. Your mother was wise. Yes, she was. And you're becoming just like her. Maylene didn't respond to that, but something in her chest loosened slightly. Just before dawn, as Maylene had predicted, Thomas's fever spiked hard. She was ready with cool compresses and more medicine, working efficiently to bring his temperature back under control. For 20 agonizing minutes, the boy thrashed and moaned, caught in fever dreams. Then, finally, the fever broke. Thomas's breathing eased, his skin cooled. His eyes, when they fluttered open briefly, showed clarity instead of delirium. "Mama?" he whispered. Sarah burst into tears, gathering her son carefully into her arms. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Maylene stood on shaking legs and walked to the window. The sun was rising over the valley, painting everything in shades of pink and gold. Behind her, she heard Sarah praying quietly, thanking forces beyond Maylene's understanding for her son's recovery. But Maylene knew the truth. It hadn't been divine intervention. It had been knowledge, skill, and vigilance. It had been her mother's legacy, working through her daughter's hands. Caleb found her there an hour later, still standing at the window, watching the ranch come to life. "Sarah says he's going to be fine," Caleb said quietly. "Yes, the fever broke. He'll need rest and continued treatment for a few more days, but the worst has passed." "You saved his life." "I did my job." "Maylene." Caleb's voice held an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Look at me." She turned reluctantly. "You saved his life," he repeated. "You could have let him die. You could have tried and failed. You could have said it was beyond your ability. But you fought for him. You fought all night, and you won. I couldn't let a child die if I had the knowledge to prevent it. Most people could. Most people would have protected themselves, would have been afraid of the blame if he died. But you didn't even hesitate." Maylene felt suddenly exhausted, wrung out emotionally and physically. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to understand that you're not just useful here. You're valued. You're respected. You're—" He stopped, seemed to struggle for words. "You're becoming part of this family." The words should have made her happy. Instead, they made her want to run. "I need to sleep," she said abruptly. "I've been awake for nearly 30 hours. Caleb stepped back, nodding. "Of course. Rest. And Maylene?" "Yes?" "Thank you for everything." She nodded and fled to her room, locking the door and collapsing onto the bed fully clothed. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind spun with thoughts she couldn't organize, feelings she didn't know how to process. Family. The word terrified her. Family meant vulnerability. Family meant caring about people who could hurt you, disappoint you, leave you. Family meant everything her father had taught her to fear. But lying there in the morning light, exhausted and emotionally raw, Maylene couldn't deny what was happening. Despite every wall she'd built, despite every defense she'd maintained, this place was working its way into her heart. These people, Sarah with her kindness, the children with their curiosity, the ranch hands with their simple respect, and Caleb with his patient, persistent gentleness, they were becoming important to her. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Thomas recovered fully, though Maylene insisted on monitoring him carefully for any sign of relapse. The story of how she'd fought through the night to save him spread through the ranch and beyond, carried by ranch hands visiting town, by neighbors stopping by to check on the boy. People started showing up from neighboring ranches, from town, even from the territorial capital 2 days' ride away. They came with ailments the town doctors couldn't cure, with sick children and injured workers and chronic conditions that had plagued them for years. Maylene treated them all. She couldn't help herself. Each person who came to her door represented a chance to use the knowledge her mother had died possessing, to give meaning to all those lessons whispered in the dark. Sarah watched this development with mixed feelings. "You're going to work yourself to death," she said one afternoon, finding Maylene in the kitchen grinding herbs for the 3rd time that day. "You've seen 15 people this week already." 16, Maylene corrected. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter came this morning about her skin rash." "That's not sustainable." "Then it's not sustainable, but I can't turn them away." "Why not? You don't owe these people anything." Maylene's hand stilled on the mortar and pestle. My mother always said that hoarding knowledge was like hoarding food during a famine. It might keep you alive, but it makes you less than human. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Your mother would be very proud of you. The words hit harder than Maylene expected. She ducked her head, focusing intently on her work. She would probably say I'm being reckless and need to charge people properly for my services. Are you charging people? Some bring payment, some don't. Doesn't matter. Maylene, I don't need money, Sarah. I need... She trailed off, unable to articulate what she actually needed. Purpose. Value. A reason to wake up each morning that wasn't just survival. A way to stop feeling like the unwanted daughter her father had sold for horses and flour. That evening, Caleb found her by the creek again. It had become their place somehow, the spot where water flowed endlessly over ancient stones. You've been avoiding me, he said without preamble. Maylene didn't deny it. Since Thomas's recovery, she'd been careful to limit her interactions with Caleb, to maintain distance, to keep their relationship purely practical. I've been busy, she said instead. Too busy to talk? Too busy to take a simple walk? Yes, Caleb sighed, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in his hands. All right, then I'll talk and you can listen. You're allowed to just listen, aren't you? Maylene said nothing, which he apparently took as assent. I've been thinking a lot lately, he began, about what it means to build a life with someone. My first marriage, with my late wife, Emily, it was good. We loved each other. We built this ranch together, made plans, dreamed dreams. When she died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd just exist, keep the ranch running, fulfill my obligations. Nothing more. He threw the stone into the creek, watching the splash and ripples. Then I saw you in town and something in me woke up. Not because you reminded me of Emily, you don't at all, but because you reminded me that survival isn't the same as living, that there's more to life than just getting through each day. Maylene's chest felt tight. Don't, she whispered. Don't what? Don't make me into something I'm not. Don't turn me into some symbol of hope or redemption or whatever this is. I'm just a girl whose father sold her. That's all I am. Caleb turned to face her fully. No, that's what happened to you. It's not who you are. Who you are is a healer who sits up all night fighting for a child's life. Who you are is someone who treats ranch hands and neighbors with the same care you'd give family. Who you are is a woman who's building something meaningful out of the worst circumstances imaginable. You don't understand, but then help me understand. The words burst out before Maylene could stop them. I'm terrified. Is that what you want to hear? I'm terrified that I'm starting to care about this place, about these people, about... She stopped herself just in time. I'm terrified because everything I've ever cared about has been taken from me. My mother, my home, my dignity, everything. And the more I let myself belong here, the more it will destroy me when it's taken away too. What makes you think it will be taken away? Because that's what happens. People leave. People die. People decide you're not worth keeping. That's the only pattern I've ever known. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. I can't promise you that nothing bad will ever happen. I can't promise that people won't die or that life won't bring more hardship. But I can promise you this. I will never sell you. I will never treat you as property. And as long as I'm alive, you will always have a place here that's yours by right, not by transaction. Why? The question came out broken. Why do you care so much? Because I see you, Maylene, not the daughter your father didn't want, not the burden he sold. I see the woman you actually are, strong and skilled and kinder than this harsh world deserves. And yes, I'm drawn to that. Yes, I hope that maybe someday you might feel the same, but even if you never do, even if you only ever see me as the man who bought you, I still want you to have a chance at a real life. Maylene felt tears on her cheeks and realized she was crying. She never cried. She'd trained herself out of that useless habit years ago. But standing by this creek with this impossibly decent man, feeling the walls she'd built starting to crumble, she couldn't stop the tears from falling. Caleb didn't try to touch her, didn't try to comfort her physically. He just stood there, solid and patient, letting her fall apart without judgment. I don't know how to do this, Maylene finally whispered. I don't know how to let people matter. Then we'll figure it out together. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people who've both lost a lot, trying to build something good. Maylene wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, feeling raw and exposed, but somehow lighter than she'd felt in years. I can't make any promises, she said. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking you to stay, to keep being who you are. The rest will work itself out, or it won't. Either way, you'll still have a home here. They stood together as the last light faded from the sky, not touching, barely speaking, but connected nonetheless by shared honesty and fragile hope. For the first time since her mother died, Maylene allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just survival. A future where she belonged somewhere because she chose it, where her worth wasn't determined by someone else's judgment, where she could be valued for exactly who she was. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thought she'd ever allowed herself to have. The conversation by the creek changed something fundamental between them, though neither spoke of it directly. In the days that followed, Maylene found herself seeking Caleb's company rather than avoiding it. Their evening walks became less about obligation and more about genuine desire to share the quiet moments when the day's work was done. They talked about everything and nothing. Caleb told her about growing up on a smaller ranch in Colorado, about learning to break horses from his father, about the dreams he and Emily had shared when they first claimed this valley. Maylene, in turn, began sharing fragments of her own past, carefully chosen memories that didn't cut too deep, stories about her mother's healing work, about the village in China she barely remembered, about the journey across the ocean that had brought her family to America. I was only 6 when we came, she said one evening as they walked along the fence line. The autumn air had turned crisp, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I don't remember much about China except the smell of my grandmother's kitchen and the sound of the river near our house. Do you ever wish you could go back? Caleb asked. To what? My grandmother is long dead. The village probably doesn't even remember my family existed. And I'm too American now to truly belong there, too Chinese to truly belong here. I exist in the space between. Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering this. Maybe belonging isn't about where you came from. Maybe it's about where you choose to be. That's easy to say when you've always belonged somewhere. Is it? His voice held an edge she hadn't heard before. I'm a widower in a territory where most men remarry within months of losing a wife. I'm running a ranch that some say is too ambitious, that will fail without a woman's touch to civilize it. I'm treated like an oddity by half the ranchers around here because I pay my hands fair wages and don't beat my horses into submission. Don't assume belonging is something that comes easy just because my skin is the right color. Maylene glanced at him, surprised by the bitterness in his tone. I didn't mean, I know what you meant. And you're right that my struggles aren't the same as yours. But loneliness is loneliness, Maylene. Feeling like an outsider is feeling like an outsider. The degree might be different, but the ache is the same. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound their boots crunching on the dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. I'm sorry, Maylene said finally, for assuming. And I'm sorry for snapping. It's just, I see you pulling away sometimes and I understand why, but I wish you could see that we're not as different as you think. We're both trying to build lives out of loss. We're both trying to prove we're more than what people assume we are. Well, the difference is that people will eventually accept you. They'll never fully accept me. Some won't, Caleb agreed. But the ones who matter already do. Sarah thinks of you as family. The children adore you. The ranch hands respect you more than they respect most of the so-called respectable women in town. That's not nothing. Maylene wanted to argue, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. In the 3 months since her arrival, she'd carved out a place for herself on this ranch that felt more solid than anything she'd known since her mother's death. The healing work continued to expand. What had started with ranch hands and neighbors had grown into something larger. People traveled from increasingly distant places, bringing sick children and injured workers and ailments that defied conventional treatment. Maylene saw them all, working from early morning until late evening, her reputation spreading across the territory like ripples in still water. She'd set up a dedicated space for her work in one of the smaller outbuildings, which Caleb had helped her clean and organize. Shelves now held carefully labeled jars of dried herbs, tinctures, and salves. A sturdy table served as both workspace and examination area. The room smelled of sage and pine and the countless other plants Maylene had collected from the valley and surrounding hills. One afternoon in late October, a man arrived on a lathered horse, his face drawn with desperation. "Please," he said, barely waiting for Maylene to step outside. "My daughter. She's been in labor for 2 days. The midwife says the baby is positioned wrong, that they'll both die. I heard you saved Thomas Hawthorne from lung fever, that you can do things the town doctors can't. Please, you have to come." Maylene's heart clenched. Childbirth was dangerous even under the best circumstances, and a prolonged labor with a malpositioned baby was often fatal for both mother and child. "How far?" she asked, already mentally cataloging what she'd need. 3 hours hard ride, maybe 4 at a safer pace. "Give me 10 minutes. She packed quickly and efficiently, herbs to strengthen contractions, others to ease pain, clean cloths, the implements her mother had taught her to use only as a last resort. Caleb appeared as she was cinching her bag closed. "I'm going with you," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You don't need to. You'll be riding for hours, likely working through the night, then riding back exhausted." "I'm going with you." Something in Maylene's chest warmed at his protectiveness, even as she wanted to insist she could manage alone. But the truth was, having Caleb beside her felt right in a way that both comforted and terrified her. "All right," she said simply. They rode hard, the desperate father leading the way. Maylene had never been comfortable on horseback. Her father had never allowed her to learn properly. But Caleb stayed close, ready to help if she faltered. The ranch they reached was smaller than Hawthorne's, the house rougher, but clearly maintained with care despite limited resources. A woman met them at the door, her face streaked with tears. "She's so weak," the woman whispered. "I don't think she has much time." Maylene didn't waste words. She followed the woman to a small bedroom where a girl, she couldn't have been more than 16, lay on a blood-soaked bed, her face gray with exhaustion and pain. The midwife, an older woman with tired eyes, looked up with a mixture of relief and resentment. "Finally. Maybe you can save what I couldn't." Maylene ignored the barb and focused on her patient. She examined the girl quickly but thoroughly, her hands gentle despite the urgency. The baby was indeed malpositioned, breech, with one arm trapped awkwardly. The contractions had weakened from the prolonged labor. Without intervention, both would die within hours. "I need everyone out except the mother and one assistant," Maylene said, her voice calm and authoritative. "Heat water, bring clean linens, and find me the strongest alcohol you have." The midwife bristled. "I've been delivering babies for 20 years. "Then you know when you're out of your depth," Maylene interrupted sharply. "I'm not questioning your skills. I'm using different ones. You can stay and assist, or you can leave. Choose quickly." The woman's face flushed, but she nodded. "I'll stay." "Good. Then help me position her." What followed was the most challenging work Maylene had ever done. Using techniques her mother had learned from generations of Chinese midwives, she worked to turn the baby internally, her hands guided by feel and knowledge passed down through centuries. The girl screamed and wept, her mother holding her hand and murmuring reassurances. Caleb waited outside with the father, his presence a steady comfort, even though Maylene couldn't see him. Hours passed. Maylene's arms ached, sweat dripped down her face, but slowly, painstakingly, she felt the baby shift, turn, move into the correct position. "Now," she told the exhausted girl. "Now you push with everything you have left. Your baby is ready. You just need to bring him into the world." The girl gathered her remaining strength and pushed. Once, twice, 3 times. And then a baby's cry split the air, weak but unmistakably alive. Maylene caught the infant, a tiny boy covered in vernix and blood but breathing, moving, living. She quickly cleared his airways and wrapped him in clean cloth before placing him in his mother's arms. The girl wept, and her mother wept, and even the hardened midwife wiped her eyes. "You did it," Maylene told the new mother quietly. "You were strong enough." "No?" the girl whispered, looking at Maylene with exhausted gratitude. "You saved us, both of us." Maylene stayed long enough to ensure both mother and baby were stable, to instruct the family on aftercare, to leave herbs for recovery and milk production. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, dawn was breaking over the hills. Caleb stood from where he'd been sitting on the porch, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep but alert. "They're alive?" he asked. "They're alive." The father grabbed Maylene's hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you. Thank you. I don't have much money, but everything I have is yours." "I don't want your money," Maylene said gently. "Use it to buy things for your grandson. That's payment enough?" The ride back to Hawthorne Ranch was slower, both of them exhausted. They stopped by a creek to water the horses and rest for a few minutes. Maylene sat on a fallen log, every muscle in her body screaming. Caleb sat beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth but not touching. "You were remarkable," he said quietly. "I could hear some of what was happening. I heard her screaming. I thought for sure." "So did I," Maylene admitted. "There were moments when I wasn't certain I could do it, when I thought my mother's techniques wouldn't be enough. But they were. This time." Caleb turned to look at her. "You save lives, Maylene. You bring hope to people who have none. Do you understand how rare that is? How valuable?" "I just do what I was trained to do." "No, you do what you choose to do. You could have said the situation was hopeless. You could have protected yourself from the blame if they died. But you fought for them, just like you fought for Thomas, just like you fight for everyone who comes to you." Maylene felt suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion. "I can't be what you think I am," she whispered. "I'm going to fail someone eventually. I'm going to lose a patient. And when I do, when you do, you'll grieve, and you'll learn, and you'll keep trying to save the next person, because that's who you are." She wanted to argue, to deflect, to retreat behind her walls. But she was too tired, and Caleb's steady presence was too comforting, and the dawn light was too beautiful on his face. So instead, she did something that terrified her. She leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself rest. Caleb went very still for a moment, then slowly, carefully, wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They sat like that as the sun rose fully, two people who'd both lost everything finding something precious in each other's presence. When they finally returned to the ranch, Sarah took one look at them and shooed Maylene upstairs to rest. But before she went, Caleb caught her hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For trusting me enough to let me come with you. For letting me see you work. For—" He paused, searching for words. "For not running away." Maylene squeezed his hand once, then released it and climbed the stairs to her room. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, and when she woke late that afternoon, something had shifted inside her. The terror was still there, the fear of loss, the anxiety about belonging, the old wounds that would never fully heal. But alongside it now was something else. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but undeniably present. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe belonging was about choosing where to be rather than where you came from. Maybe home was something you could build rather than something you inherited. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath after years of holding herself tight against the world. The next few weeks brought a rhythm that felt almost normal. Maylene continued her healing work. Caleb ran the ranch, Sarah managed the household, and the children grew more comfortable pulling Maylene into their games and conversations. Matthew showed her his collection of interesting rocks. Rebecca taught her a complicated hand-clapping game. Thomas insisted on holding her hand whenever they walked together. The ranch hands had stopped treating her as an outsider and started treating her as one of them, teasing her gently, asking her advice, including her in their rough camaraderie. Pete had appointed himself her unofficial protector, glowering at anyone who looked at her sideways when she went to town for supplies. It was during one of these trips to town that everything changed. Maylene had gone with Sarah to purchase fabric and thread, some dried goods that the ranch didn't produce, and special items needed for her medical work. They'd finished their shopping and were loading packages into the wagon when a commotion erupted near the sheriff's office. A crowd had gathered, voices raised in anger and excitement. Maylene tried to ignore it. Town drama rarely concerned her, but Sarah's face had gone pale. "That's the sheriff," Sarah said quietly, "and those are territorial marshals with him. Something serious must have happened." They finished loading and were about to leave when a voice cut through the crowd noise like a knife. A voice speaking Cantonese, harsh and familiar and absolutely impossible. Maylene's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly, her body moving against her will, and saw him. Zhao Wei, her father, standing in front of the sheriff's office, gesturing angrily, his face twisted with rage and righteous indignation. "No," Maylene whispered. "No, no, no." Sarah's hand gripped her arm. "Maylene, what is it? Do you know that man?" But Maylene couldn't answer. She could only watch in horror as her father argued with the sheriff, as official-looking papers were produced, as one of the marshals nodded and pointed toward the general store, toward where Maylene stood frozen in the street. The sheriff spotted her then, his expression shifting to something like pity. He started walking in her direction, her father following, still shouting in Cantonese. "You!" Zhao Wei spat when he was close enough. "You think you can run from your duty? You think you can shame me further by playing at being a white man's woman?" Maylene's voice came out strangled. "I didn't run. You sold me." "I placed you in service to pay our family's debts," her father said in English now, for the benefit of the authorities. "And this man, this Caleb Hawthorne, he stole you. He took my daughter without my permission, without proper contract. I want her returned. She belongs to me." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Miss Zhao, is this man your father?" Maylene wanted to lie, wanted to deny any connection to this man who'd sold her like livestock, but the marshals held papers, and her father's face was unmistakable in its resemblance to her own features. "Yes," she whispered. "Then I'm afraid we have a situation," the sheriff said. "Your father has filed a complaint claiming you were taken illegally. He's demanding your return." "She was sold," Sarah interjected, her voice shaking with rage. "He sold her to a merchant who delivered her to Mr. Hawthorne. There was nothing illegal about it." "The transaction was made under false pretenses," Zhao Wei insisted. "I was told she would be employed as a servant with proper wages. Instead, she has been made a concubine, a kept woman. This is a violation of the agreement." "That's a lie," Maylene said, finding her voice. "There was no agreement. There were no wages. He sold me for horses and flour and wanted me gone so he wouldn't have to look at the daughter who reminded him of his failures." The crowd had grown larger, people pressing in to hear this drama unfold. Maylene felt their stares like brands on her skin, curious, judgmental, entertained by her humiliation. "This is a family matter," the sheriff said carefully. "Perhaps it should be discussed in private." "No." Maylene's voice rang out clear and strong, surprising even herself. "Let everyone hear. Let them all know the truth about the Honorable Zhao Wei, who blames his daughter for his wife's death, who treated her like a servant in his own house, who sold her to the first person who offered enough silver." Her father's face flushed dark with rage. "You ungrateful!" "I owed you nothing," Maylene continued, her voice rising. "You gave me nothing but blame and cruelty. My mother taught me everything of value I know, and you hated her for it. You hated me for surviving when she didn't. Well, I'm done carrying your shame. I'm done being the daughter you never wanted." The crowd had gone silent, shocked by her outburst. Even the sheriff looked taken aback. Zhao Wei recovered first, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "You see how she has been corrupted? How she speaks to her own father? This is what comes from allowing her to run wild with these people. Sheriff, I demand you enforce the law. A daughter belongs to her father until she is properly married. Return her to me." The sheriff looked between them, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "The law is complicated in these matters. Technically, if there was no legal contract, there was a transaction," one of the marshals interrupted. He was a hard-faced man with cold eyes who clearly found this whole situation distasteful. "We have a witness, the merchant who facilitated the sale. He confirms that Zhao Wei accepted payment for his daughter. That makes this a legal sale, not a kidnapping." Relief flooded through Maylene, but her father wasn't finished. "The sale was for servitude, not concubinage. If Hawthorne wants to keep her, he must make it legitimate. He must marry her according to the law, or she returns to my custody." "You have no custody," Maylene said desperately. "You gave that up when you sold me." But the marshal was nodding slowly. "He has a point. The territorial laws on this are clear. An unmarried Chinese woman cannot simply live with a white man outside of a formal employment contract or legal marriage. It's considered morally corrupting to both parties. Either there needs to be a proper contract of employment, or they need to marry, or she returns to her father's custody." The world tilted sickeningly beneath Maylene's feet. After everything, after finding safety, after building a life, after finally starting to believe she might belong somewhere, it was all being torn away by legal technicalities and her father's vindictive determination to maintain control. "Mr. Hawthorne isn't here to speak for himself," Sarah said desperately. "You can't make this decision without hearing from both parties." "Then bring him to town," the marshal said flatly. "Tomorrow, noon. We'll settle this matter then. Until that time, Miss Zhao remains in her father's custody." "No," Maylene gasped. "Please." But the marshal was already moving, and her father's hand clamped around her arm like a vice. "You will come with me," Zhao Wei hissed in Cantonese, "and you will remember your place." Maylene looked desperately at Sarah, who stood white-faced and trembling with rage and helplessness. "Get Caleb," Maylene said quietly. "Please, get Caleb." Then her father dragged her away through the staring crowd, back toward the small dark shop where she'd once lived like a ghost, and Maylene felt 4 months of freedom crumbling to ash around her. The shop smelled exactly as Maylene remembered: stale rice, old wood, and the bitter residue of her father's pipe tobacco. Zhao Wei shoved her through the door and immediately locked it behind them, pocketing the key. "You have disgraced me," he said in Cantonese, his voice low and venomous. "Standing in the street like a common prostitute, shouting your lies for everyone to hear. Your mother would be ashamed." The mention of her mother sparked something fierce in Maylene's chest. "My mother would be ashamed of you, for selling your daughter, for blaming a child for her own birth, for wasting the life she gave you on bitterness and hate." The slap came fast, snapping her head to the side. Maylene tasted blood but refused to cry out, refused to give him the satisfaction. "You will sleep in the storage room," Zhao Wei said coldly. "You will not speak to anyone. You will not go near the windows. Tomorrow, when this rancher comes, you will tell the authorities that you were deceived, that you wish to return to your proper place. And then you will work in this shop until I find a suitable husband for you, a Chinese man who will know how to control an ungrateful daughter." "I'll tell them the truth," Maylene said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I'll tell them everything." "You'll tell them what I say, or I will make certain your precious rancher faces charges for abduction and moral corruption. The territorial laws favor fathers, girl. You think those marshals care about your happiness? They care about order, and order means daughters obey their fathers." He grabbed her arm and dragged her to the storage room, barely larger than a closet, windowless and dark. The same room where she'd slept for 4 years, where she'd cried herself to sleep after her mother died, where she'd learned to make herself invisible. "Think carefully about tomorrow," Zhao Wei said before slamming the door. She heard him slide the bolt home, locking her inside. Maylene stood in the darkness, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Everything she'd built, everything she'd become over the past 4 months, it all hung by a thread now, dependent on legal technicalities and the whims of men who saw her as property to be distributed according to proper procedure. She thought about Caleb, about the gentle patience in his eyes and the quiet strength of his presence. She thought about Sarah and the children, about Pete and the other ranch hands, about the people she'd healed and the life she'd been building one small choice at a time. And she thought about her mother, who taught her that understanding came before action, that watching and listening gave you power that speaking too soon could never match. Maylene felt along the wall until she found the corner where she used to sleep. She sank down, wrapped her arms around her knees, and began to think. Hours passed in the darkness. Maylene heard her father moving around the shop, heard the familiar sounds of him preparing his evening meal, smoking his pipe, eventually retiring to his own room. The shop fell silent except for the creaking of old wood and the distant sounds of the town settling for the night. Maylene didn't sleep. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she reviewed everything she knew about the territorial laws, pieced together from conversations she'd overheard over the years. The marshal was right. Unmarried women, especially Chinese women, existed in a legal gray area. They were expected to be under the protection and control of a male relative until marriage transferred that control to a husband. But there were exceptions. Employment contracts could provide legal independence, and marriage, of course, changed everything. The thought of marriage made Maylene's chest tight. Not because she didn't care for Caleb, she did, more than she'd admitted even to herself. But because marriage should be a choice made freely, not a legal necessity forced by her father's vindictiveness. Still, if it came to that, If marriage was the only way to secure her freedom, Maylene pushed the thought away. First, she needed to survive until tomorrow. Then she needed to stand before the sheriff and the marshals and make them understand that she was more than property to be transferred between men. Sometime near dawn, Maylene heard horses outside. Voices, a commotion. Then Caleb's voice, loud and urgent. "Where is she? I want to see her now." Her father's response was too muffled to hear, but Caleb's voice rose again. "I don't care about your rights as a father. You sold her. You don't get to pretend you're protecting her now." "You must wait until the hearing," came the marshal's voice, tired but firm. "That's the law, Mr. Hawthorne. Noon today. Everyone will have their say then." Maylene pressed her ear against the door, straining to hear more, but the voices moved away. She heard horses departing, then silence. Her father didn't come to unlock the door. Hours passed. Maylene's throat grew parched, her stomach cramped with hunger, but she refused to call out, refused to beg. Finally, when the angle of light under the door suggested late morning, Jiawei slid back the bolt. "Come," he said curtly. "It's time." Maylene emerged stiff and aching. Her father handed her a basin of water and a cloth. "Clean yourself. Make yourself presentable. Remember what I told you." Maylene washed her face and hands, tried to smooth her rumpled dress. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror her mother had once used and saw a stranger, face pale, eyes shadowed, but jaw set with determination. "I will tell the truth," she said quietly to her reflection. "Whatever happens, I will tell the truth." The walk to the sheriff's office felt like a death march. Townspeople stopped to stare, whispered to each other behind their hands. Maylene kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to show the fear that threatened to choke her. The office was crowded when they arrived. The sheriff sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable. The two territorial marshals stood flanking him, their faces impassive. And there, standing near the window with Sarah beside him, was Caleb. Their eyes met across the room, and Maylene saw everything she needed to see in his face: worry, determination, and something fierce and protective that made her throat tight. "All right," the sheriff said heavily. "Let's get this settled. Mr. Zhao, you've claimed your daughter was taken illegally. Mr. Hawthorne, you claim the transaction was legal and legitimate. Miss Zhao, you're at the center of this. I think we need to hear from you." Maylene stepped forward, very aware of her father's presence beside her, radiating threat even without words. "What do you want, miss?" the sheriff asked, not unkindly. "And before you answer, understand that this is a legal proceeding. Your testimony will be recorded and may be used in further proceedings if necessary." Maylene took a breath, gathering her courage. "I want to tell you what happened, all of it. And then I want you to understand that I am not a piece of property to be transferred between men according to whoever has the proper paperwork." The hard-faced marshal frowned. "The law is the law, miss. Your wants don't change what's legal." "Then hear my story and tell me what justice looks like under your law," Maylene said, her voice steady. 4 months ago, my father sold me to a merchant named Dwight for horses, flour, and silver. I was not consulted. I was not informed of the terms. I was dragged from my bed in the middle of the night and handed over like livestock. "That's not," her father began, but the sheriff held up a hand. "Let her speak." "The merchant transported me to Hawthorne Ranch, where Mr. Hawthorne had requested me specifically. When I arrived, terrified and expecting to be enslaved, or worse, Mr. Hawthorne gave me a room with a lock on the inside. He gave me food and clothing. He told me I was safe. And then—" her voice wavered slightly but held firm. "Then he gave me the freedom to choose my own path." She turned to look at Caleb, then back at the sheriff. "I was not forced to work. I was not kept as a concubine or a servant. I chose to use my skills as a healer to help the people on the ranch. I chose to stay because for the first time in my life since my mother died, I was treated as a person with value. Not as a burden, not as a source of shame, as someone whose knowledge and skills mattered." "None of this changes the legal facts," the hard marshal said. "An unmarried woman living with a man who isn't her relative. I lived in the main house with Mr. Hawthorne's sister-in-law and her 3 children," Maylene interrupted. "I had my own locked room. Mr. Hawthorne never entered it. He never touched me without permission. He treated me with more respect in 4 months than my father showed me in 18 years. Zhao Wei's face had gone dark with rage, but he held his tongue, clearly warned by the marshals to let the proceedings continue. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Zhao, I understand this is difficult, but the law requires that an unmarried woman be under the protection of a male relative or legal guardian. Your father is claiming that right. Unless there's a legal employment contract or marriage, I don't have grounds to deny his claim. Even though he sold me? Maylene's voice cracked. Even though he took payment for his daughter like she was a horse or a piece of furniture? That's legal? The transaction was irregular, the other marshal admitted, but not explicitly illegal under territorial law. Indentured servitude arrangements are permitted. Without proof of force or fraud, he took payment and then reported me stolen, Maylene said desperately. How is that not fraud? He claims he was misled about the terms, the sheriff said. And without the merchant here to testify otherwise, it's your word against your father's. The trap was closing around her. Maylene could feel it, could see her fragile freedom slipping away with each word of legal procedure. Then Caleb stepped forward. If the law requires marriage or employment contract, he said clearly, then I'm asking Maylene to marry me. Right here, right now, in front of these witnesses. The room went dead silent. Maylene's heart stopped, then started again with a painful thud. You can't marry her without her father's permission? Zhao Wei snarled. She's not of age. She's 18, Caleb said, his eyes locked on Maylene's face. That's of legal age in this territory. She doesn't need parental permission. The betrothal must be proper, her father insisted. There must be negotiation, bride price, proper contracts. That's Chinese custom, not territorial law, the second marshal said, consulting a thick book. Under territorial law, any woman 18 or older can consent to marriage without parental approval. If both parties consent and a legal officiant performs the ceremony, the marriage is valid. I'm a justice of the peace, the sheriff said slowly. I can perform the ceremony legally. All eyes turned to Maylene. This was it, the moment of choice. She could refuse, could insist on fighting this through legal channels, could hope that somehow the law would protect her despite all evidence to the contrary. Or she could choose Caleb, choose the life she'd been building, choose freedom on the only terms the law would recognize. But it had to be her choice, not because the law demanded it, not because she was trapped, because she wanted it. Maylene looked at Caleb, really looked at him. She saw the man who'd given her a locked room and the freedom to use it, who'd worked beside his ranch hands instead of lording over them, who'd ridden through the night so she wouldn't have to face a difficult birth alone, who'd offered her belonging without demanding anything in return. And she saw something else. She saw her own future, uncertain but hers to shape if she was brave enough to claim it. Before I answer, Maylene said quietly, I need to say something. Caleb nodded, waiting. 4 months ago, I was sold like property. If I marry you now under these circumstances, it might look like I'm just being transferred from one owner to another. I need everyone in this room to understand that's not what's happening. She turned to face the sheriff and marshals directly. I am choosing. Not because the law gives me no other option, though it doesn't. Not because I'm desperate, though I am. But because in 4 months at Hawthorne Ranch, I learned what it feels like to be valued for who I am rather than judged for what I'm not. I learned that I have skills worth sharing, that I can build something meaningful, that I deserve respect and dignity. Her voice grew stronger. My father taught me that I was worthless, that I was a burden, that my only value was in being invisible and obedient. But my mother taught me that knowledge is power, that healing is sacred, that strength comes from choosing to stand up even when everything in you wants to hide. She turned back to Caleb, her heart in her throat. So yes, I'll marry you. Not because the law requires it, not because I have no other choice, but because I choose you. I choose the life we could build together. I choose freedom over fear and hope over hiding. The silence that followed felt sacred. Then Caleb crossed the room in 3 long strides and took both her hands in his. I promise you, he said, his voice rough with emotion, that you will always have a choice, that your voice will always matter, that I will spend every day earning the trust you're giving me right now. I know, Maylene said simply, and she did. The ceremony was brief and practical, nothing like the elaborate Chinese weddings her mother had described, or the grand affairs Maylene had seen in town. The sheriff recited the necessary legal words. Caleb and Maylene repeated their vows. Sarah and one of the marshals served as witnesses. And just like that, Maylene Zhao became Maylene Hawthorne. Her father stood rigid throughout, his face a mask of fury and impotent rage. When the sheriff pronounced them married, Zhao Wei turned on his heel and stormed from the office without a word. Maylene watched him go and felt nothing. No grief, no relief. Just a quiet certainty that she'd severed the last chain connecting her to a past that had nearly destroyed her. "It's done," the sheriff said, signing the marriage certificate with a flourish. "You're legally married under territorial law. Mr. Zhao has no further claim." The hard-faced marshal looked at Maylene with something that might have been respect. "You made a bold choice, Mrs. Hawthorne. I hope it serves you well." "So do I," Maylene said quietly. Outside the office, Sarah threw her arms around Maylene, laughing and crying at the same time. "I can't believe that just happened. I can't believe you're actually married." "Neither can I," Maylene admitted. She looked at Caleb, who stood a little apart, giving her space to process everything that had just occurred. Their eyes met, and she saw uncertainty there, as if he was afraid he'd pushed her into something she'd regret. Maylene stepped away from Sarah and walked to him. Without overthinking it, without second-guessing herself, she took his hand. "Take me home," she said simply. Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. "Home," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Home," Maylene confirmed. The ride back to the ranch felt different somehow. Maylene sat beside Caleb in the wagon, very aware of the ring now on her finger, a simple gold band that the sheriff had produced from somewhere, probably meant for occasions exactly like this. Sarah rode behind them, humming happily to herself. When they crested the rise and the ranch spread out below them in the afternoon light, Maylene felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just a place she was staying anymore. This was hers now, legally and officially. This was home. The ranch hands had gathered in the yard, clearly having heard the news. As the wagon rolled to a stop, Pete stepped forward, his weathered face split in a rare grin. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, sweeping his hat off. "About damn time, if you ask me." The other hands echoed the sentiment, offering awkward congratulations and good wishes. Matthew, Rebecca, and Thomas came running from the house, the children's excitement infectious. "Does this mean you're staying forever?" Thomas asked, grabbing Maylene's hand. "Yes," Maylene said, surprised by how easily the word came. "I'm staying." "Good," Rebecca declared, "because you're the only one who knows how to braid hair properly." The practical comment made everyone laugh, breaking the tension. Sarah shooed the children inside to help prepare what she insisted would be a proper wedding dinner, never mind that they'd had no warning. Caleb and Maylene were left alone in the yard as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. "We should talk," Caleb said quietly, "about what this means, about expectations." "All right," Maylene agreed. They walked to their spot by the creek, the path familiar now, worn by months of evening walks and quiet conversations. When they reached the water, Caleb turned to face her. "I need you to understand something," he said. "What happened today, the marriage? I know it wasn't how either of us imagined it might happen. I know you felt cornered by the law and your father's manipulation. And I want you to know that nothing has to change between us unless you want it to." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you still have your room, your lock, your privacy. This marriage gives you legal protection, but it doesn't give me any rights over you. We can be married in name only, if that's what you need. There's no pressure, no expectations. We'll figure this out together, at whatever pace feels right to you." Maylene studied his face in the fading light. He meant every word. She could see it in his eyes. He'd married her to save her from her father, to give her the legal protection she needed, but he wasn't demanding anything in return. The gesture was so perfectly Caleb, so consistent with everything he'd shown her over the past 4 months, that Maylene felt her last remaining walls begin to crumble. "And if I want things to change?" she asked softly. Caleb went very still. "Then we talk about it. Together. As equals." "Equals," Maylene repeated, tasting the word. "I've never been anyone's equal before." "You are now." She stepped closer to him, her heart pounding, but her decision made. I choose you, Caleb. I said it in the sheriff's office, but I want to say it again here, without the law and the marshals and my father watching. I choose you. I choose this life. I choose to stop running from the possibility that I might actually deserve to be happy. Maylene, I'm terrified, she continued, the words tumbling out now. I'm terrified that I don't know how to be married, that I'll fail at being a wife, that I'll disappoint you or the ranch or myself. I'm terrified that something will happen to take this all away. But I'm more terrified of living my whole life afraid to grab hold of something good. Caleb reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. You couldn't disappoint me if you tried. You're the bravest person I've ever met. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. That's what brave is, Caleb said gently. Being afraid and doing the hard thing anyway. He leaned down slowly, and Maylin rose up on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was soft and tentative, a question asked and answered, a promise made without words. When they pulled apart, Maylene was shaking, not with fear, but with the overwhelming realization that this was real, that this man was her husband, that this life was actually hers. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Neither do I, Caleb admitted. We'll learn together. They stood together as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who'd both lost everything learning to build something new from the ruins of their pasts. That night, there was indeed a wedding dinner. Sarah had worked miracles with limited notice, producing a feast that had the whole household gathered around the large dining table. The children chattered excitedly, the ranch hands offered increasingly ridiculous toasts, and Pete made a surprisingly eloquent speech about finding family in unexpected places. Maylene sat beside her husband. The words still felt foreign and wonderful, and felt the warmth of belonging settle around her like a well-worn quilt. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the house had grown quiet, Caleb walked Maylene upstairs. They stopped outside her room. Their rooms now, she supposed, though they'd need to figure out those logistics. Thank you, Maylene said quietly. For today. For everything. You don't need to thank me for basic decency. Maybe not, but I'm going to anyway. Caleb smiled, that gentle expression that had first made her think he might be different from other men. Get some rest. Tomorrow we can start figuring out what our life looks like. He turned to go to his own room, but Maylene caught his hand. Stay, she said, then clarified quickly. Just to talk. I'm not ready for everything, but I don't want to be alone tonight. All right, Caleb said simply. They sat together on the floor with their backs against the bed, talking quietly about nothing and everything. About the ranch and the coming winter. About Sarah's cooking and Thomas's endless energy. About small, normal things that felt precious precisely because they were normal. Sometime near dawn, Maylene fell asleep with her head on Caleb's shoulder. He stayed until she woke, just as he'd promised, solid and steady and exactly what she needed. For the first time in her life, Maylene Zhao, now Maylene Hawthorne, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved exactly this. Safety, respect, belonging, love. And somewhere in the growing light of a new day, the girl who'd been sold like property and told she was worthless began to understand that she'd always been precious. It had just taken finding the right people to help her see it. The first weeks of married life unfolded with a gentleness that surprised Maylene. She'd braced herself for demands, for expectations, for the loss of the autonomy she'd only just begun to claim. Instead, Caleb continued to treat her exactly as he had before, with respect, with patience, with a quiet devotion that asked nothing in return. They moved slowly toward building a life together. Maylene kept her room for several weeks while they learned each other's rhythms and habits. Caleb would knock before entering any space she occupied. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions. He made space for her healing work without complaint, even when patients arrived at odd hours or she spent entire days away tending to someone in need. It was Sarah who finally pushed them toward a more traditional arrangement one evening in late November. You're married, she said bluntly over dinner. You sleep in separate rooms like strangers. The children are confused, the ranch hands are gossiping, and frankly, it's ridiculous. Maylene felt her face heat. We're taking our time. Taking your time is fine. Acting like roommates who barely know each other is not. You're partners now, act like it. That night, after much discussion and more than a little awkwardness, Maylin moved her belongings into Caleb's room. The room they would share. Their room. It felt monumental and terrifying and right all at once. "We don't have to rush anything," Caleb said as they prepared for bed that first night, both of them acutely aware of the single bed they'd be sharing. "We can just sleep. That's allowed." "I know," Maylene said. Then more quietly, "But I don't want to be afraid forever. I don't want my father's cruelty or my past to dictate my future. I want to choose this. Choose us." Caleb pulled her close, and they lay together in the darkness, talking softly until sleep claimed them both. And in the morning, waking wrapped in her husband's arms, Maylene felt another piece of her past lose its power over her present. The healing work continued to expand as winter settled over the valley. Word of Maylene's skills had spread far beyond the immediate area, and people traveled through increasingly difficult weather to seek her help. She treated frostbite and winter fevers, delivered babies in snowbound cabins, and taught families how to prepare remedies from the limited resources available during the harsh months. Caleb often accompanied her on these journeys, driving the wagon through snow-choked roads, waiting patiently while she worked, ensuring she had everything she needed. The ranch hands had taken to calling them the healer and her shadow, which made Maylene smile despite herself. It was during one of these trips, 3 months after their marriage, that everything changed. They'd traveled to a mining camp 2 days' ride from the ranch to treat an outbreak of dysentery. Maylene had spent 2 exhausting days managing the sick, teaching the camp's residents proper sanitation practices, and ensuring they understood how to prevent future outbreaks. She and Caleb had just started the journey home when they heard shouting from the trail ahead. They crested a small rise to find a scene of chaos, an overturned wagon, scattered supplies, and a man desperately trying to control 2 panicked horses while a woman screamed for help. Caleb immediately jumped down to help with the horses while Maylene ran to the wagon. The woman was pinned beneath it, her leg trapped at an unnatural angle, her face gray with shock and pain. "My husband," she gasped. "He can't lift it alone. Please." Maylene assessed the situation quickly. The wagon was heavy, laden with supplies. The woman's leg was clearly broken, possibly crushed. Moving her wrong could cause catastrophic damage. "Caleb," Maylene called, "I need you and this other man to lift on my count. Lift straight up, hold it steady. Don't let it shift." The 2 men positioned themselves while Maylene knelt beside the trapped woman. "When they lift, I'm going to pull you free. It's going to hurt. Don't fight me." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Now," Maylene commanded. The men strained, muscles bulging as they lifted the wagon. Down. Maylene grabbed the woman under her arms and pulled, moving her as smoothly as possible away from the wreckage. The moment she was clear, the men let the wagon drop with a heavy thud. The woman's leg was a disaster, compound fracture with bone visible through torn flesh, already swelling, bleeding steadily. Without proper treatment, she'd lose the leg. Even with treatment, it would be a difficult save. "We need to get her somewhere warm and stable," Maylene said. "The bone needs to be set, the wound cleaned and closed. It can't wait." "There's a way station about an hour from here," the husband said desperately. "Small place, but it has a roof and a stove." "Then that's where we go. Help me immobilize this leg first." Working quickly, Maylene created a splint from broken wagon boards and strips of cloth, securing the leg as best she could for transport. The woman had passed out from the pain, which Maylene counted as a mercy. They made it to the way station as the sun was setting. The place was rough, just a single room with a fireplace, a table, and some basic supplies. But it would have to do. Caleb built up the fire while Maylene laid out everything she'd need. The husband hovered anxiously until Maylene sent him outside to gather snow for cooling compresses. "This is going to be difficult," Maylene told Caleb quietly. "The bone needs to be set properly and I need to clean the wound thoroughly or infection will take her. I've never done something this complicated without my mother guiding me." "You've delivered breech babies and saved children from lung fever," Caleb said firmly. "You can do this. Tell me what you need." What followed was the most challenging medical work Maylene had ever attempted. She gave the woman a strong tincture for pain, enough to dull the agony, but not so much it would stop her breathing. Then, with Caleb holding the woman steady and following Maylene's precise instructions, she began the delicate process of setting the bone. It took 3 attempts to get the alignment right. Each time, the woman screamed despite the pain medicine, and Maylene had to fight down her own nausea and doubt. But finally, she felt the bones slide into proper position. Next came cleaning the wound, removing debris, cutting away dead tissue, creating conditions where healthy flesh could knit back together. Maylene worked with steady hands, drawing on every lesson her mother had taught her, every scrap of knowledge she'd accumulated over years of study and practice. Hours passed. The husband returned to find Maylene stitching the wound closed with careful, even stitches, while Caleb supported the splinted leg in exactly the position she needed. "Is she going to live?" the man asked, his voice breaking. "Yes," Maylene said, surprising herself with her certainty. "The leg will heal. She'll walk again, though she may limp. But she'll live." And she did. They stayed at the way station for 3 days, monitoring for infection, adjusting the splint, teaching the husband how to care for his wife during the long recovery ahead. When they finally resumed their journey home, the woman was sitting up, eating solid food, and talking about the garden she'd plant come spring. "You saved her leg," Caleb said as they rode through the snow. "Maybe her life." "We saved her," Maylene corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." Something had shifted during those intense hours of medical work. Maylene had discovered a confidence in her abilities she hadn't known she possessed. She'd faced the hardest challenge of her healing career and succeeded. More than that, she'd succeeded with Caleb as her partner, working in perfect synchronization as if they'd been doing this together for years. When they arrived home, Sarah took one look at their exhausted faces and sent them both straight to bed. Maylene fell asleep before her head hit the pillow, and when she woke hours later, she found Caleb watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "What?" she asked sleepily. "I'm just thinking about how remarkable you are. How lucky I am." "I'm the lucky one," Maylene said, and meant it with her whole heart. Winter deepened, and with it came a routine that felt like the life Maylene had never dared to imagine. She worked alongside Caleb in managing the ranch, her opinion valued in decisions large and small. She continued her healing practice, now with a dedicated space in one of the larger outbuildings that Caleb had helped her outfit properly. She spent evenings with Sarah and the children, teaching Rebecca herbal medicine, while Matthew peppered her with questions about anatomy, and Thomas simply wanted her attention. It was during one of these quiet January evenings that Maylene realized something was different with her own body. Subtle changes at first: nausea in the mornings, unusual fatigue, a heightened sensitivity to smells. She'd been so busy with her work and her new life that she'd barely noticed when her monthly courses failed to arrive. Now, counting back, she realized it had been nearly 2 months. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was carrying Caleb's child. Maylene sat alone in her healing room, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach, and felt terror and joy warring in her chest. A child meant vulnerability. It meant caring about something even more precious than her own life. It meant risking the kind of devastating loss she'd experienced when her mother died. But it also meant hope. It meant a future that extended beyond just surviving. It meant creating a family built on love instead of obligation, raising a child who would know they were wanted, valued, cherished. She told Caleb that night, her hands shaking as she placed his palm against her stomach. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Caleb's face went through a series of emotions: shock, wonder, fierce joy, then worry. "Are you happy about this?" he asked carefully. "I know we haven't talked about children yet. I know this is fast." "I'm terrified," Maylene admitted. "But yes, I'm happy. Are you?" In answer, Caleb pulled her close and held her like she was something infinitely precious. "I'm beyond happy. I'm honored. I'm grateful. He pulled back to look at her face. "I promise you, this child will know nothing but love. They'll never doubt their worth. They'll never feel unwanted." "I know," Maylene whispered. "That's why I'm not as terrified as I could be. Because I know you'll be an amazing father." "We'll be amazing parents," Caleb corrected. "Together." The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. Sarah cried happy tears and immediately began planning. The ranch hands offered awkward congratulations. The children were ecstatic at the prospect of a baby to dote on. But it was Pete's reaction that surprised Maylene most. The grizzled ranch hand pulled her aside one morning and pressed something into her hand. A small wooden horse, carved with surprising delicacy. "Made it for my own son, years back," he said gruffly. "Lost him and his mother to fever when he wasn't but 2 years old. Been carrying this around ever since, couldn't quite let it go. But I figure it's time it had a new life. Your child will be loved here, Mrs. Hawthorne. This whole ranch will watch over them." Maylin clutched the little horse and fought back tears. "Thank you, Pete, for this and for everything." "No thanks needed. You gave me back my shoulder when I thought I'd never work again. You've healed half the hands on this ranch and a dozen families besides. You're one of us now. We take care of our own." Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts to reveal the valley's bones beneath. As Maylin's pregnancy progressed, she began to feel the first flutter of movement, tiny kicks and rolls that made her gasp with wonder. She continued her healing work through it all, though Sarah and Caleb both fussed over her constantly, insisting she not overexert herself. Maylin found their concern endearing even when it was excessive. It was in early April, when green was just starting to return to the hills, that Zhao Wei returned. Maylin was in the garden with Rebecca, teaching the girl about early spring herbs, when she heard shouting from the yard. She looked up to see her father standing beside a wagon loaded with his belongings, his face twisted with the bitter rage she remembered so well. "You think you've won," he shouted in Cantonese when he saw her. "You think you've escaped the shame of your birth. But everyone knows what you are. The Chinese whore who married a white man, the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her duty." Maylin stood slowly, one hand unconsciously moving to protect her swelling belly. Rebecca pressed close to her side, frightened by the angry stranger. Caleb emerged from the barn, his face dark with anger. "You need to leave. Now." "I'm leaving," Zhao Wei spat. "This town, this territory. I'm going to California, where there are proper Chinese communities, where daughters know their place and men aren't fooled by pretty faces and false healing." "Then go," Maylin said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Leave and don't come back. But before I go, I want you to know something." Her father's smile was cruel. "Your mother would be ashamed of you, ashamed of what you've become. She taught you to heal, and you've used that knowledge to whore yourself to a white man." The words should have hurt. For years, they would have destroyed her. But standing in the garden of her home, surrounded by people who loved her, carrying a child conceived in tenderness rather than obligation, Maylin felt nothing but pity for the bitter man who'd never learned to see past his own pain. "My mother," she said clearly, "taught me that knowledge is power, that healing is sacred. That strength comes from choosing to stand up even when everything in you wants to hide. She taught me to value myself when the whole world said I was worthless, and she would be proud of the woman I've become." She would be proud," Maylin repeated, her voice ringing with certainty. "Because I use the gifts she gave me to help people. Because I choose love over bitterness. Because I'm building a life that honors her memory instead of wallowing in shame and hatred like you do." Zhao Wei's face turned purple with rage. "You ungrateful—" "No," Caleb interrupted, moving to stand beside Maylin. "She's not ungrateful. She's free. And you can't stand it because it means you lost. You sold her thinking you'd be rid of the burden. Instead, she thrived. She became someone important and respected and loved. And you're still the same bitter man who blames everyone else for his failures." Several ranch hands had gathered now, forming a protective semicircle around Maylin. Pete stood at the front, his hand resting casually on the knife at his belt. "I think you've said your piece," the sheriff said, riding into the yard. Apparently someone had fetched him when Zhao Wei arrived. "And now you're going to get in that wagon and leave. These good people don't need to hear any more of your poison. She's my daughter." "She's a married woman and a respected healer," the sheriff corrected. "She's not your anything, and if you come back to this ranch or harass Mrs. Hawthorne again, I'll have you arrested for disturbing the peace. Are we clear?" Zhao Wei looked around at the circle of hostile faces and seemed to finally understand that he'd lost. Whatever satisfaction he'd hoped to gain from this confrontation, it wasn't going to happen. "You'll regret this," he said, one last desperate attempt at control. "All of you." "The only thing I regret," Maylin said quietly, "is that I wasted so many years believing the lies you told me about my worth. But I'm done with that now. I'm done with you." Jawei climbed into his wagon and drove away without another word. Maylene watched him disappear down the road. This man who'd given her life but never love, who'd blamed her for his pain but never acknowledged her strength. And then she turned away, back to her garden and her home, and the people who actually mattered. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm fine," Maylene said, and realized it was true. "He has no power over me anymore. He's just a bitter old man I used to know." Sarah appeared with tea and reassurances. The ranch hands dispersed back to their work, muttering about what they'd have done if the sheriff hadn't shown up when he did. Rebecca stayed close, her young face serious. "Was that really your father?" she asked. "By blood, yes, but family is more than blood. Family is the people who choose to love you and stand beside you. That man was just someone I used to live with." "Like how you're our family now, even though you're not our blood aunt?" "Exactly like that," Maylene said, pulling the girl close. That night, lying in bed with Caleb's hand resting on her growing belly, Maylene felt a profound sense of peace. Her father's final attempt to hurt her had failed, not because she'd hardened herself against his words, but because she'd grown strong enough to see them for what they were. The desperate attacks of a man who'd lost everything through his own choices. "I never want our child to feel what I felt," Maylene said quietly. "I never want them to doubt that they're wanted and loved." "They won't," Caleb promised. "Every day of their life, they'll know they're precious. They'll know they're valued. They'll know they're exactly who they're supposed to be." "How can you be so sure?" "Because they'll have you as a mother. And if they turn out to be even half as strong and compassionate and remarkable as you are, they'll be extraordinary." Maylene turned in his arms, pressing close. "I love you," she said. The words still felt new, still carried weight, but they were true down to her bones. "I love you too," Caleb replied. "I loved you the moment I saw you in that shop window, working despite your father's cruelty. I loved you when you saved Thomas. I loved you when you fought all night for that boy's life. And I love you now, carrying our child and building a life that matters." They held each other as spring rain began to fall outside, gentle and cleansing, washing away the last traces of winter. The months that followed were perhaps the happiest of Maylene's life. Her belly swelled with the growing child, and the whole ranch seemed to orbit around her in protective circles. Sarah fussed over her diet. The children drew pictures of what they imagined the baby would look like. Caleb built a cradle with his own hands, carved with intricate patterns that would catch the light and delight infant eyes. Maylene continued her healing work up until the final weeks, when even she had to admit that climbing into wagons and riding long distances was no longer practical. Patients came to the ranch instead, and she saw them in her healing room, her growing belly a testament to the life she'd built. The baby came on a warm June evening, arriving with surprising speed after a relatively easy labor. Sarah served as midwife with Caleb nearby, and when Maylene finally held her daughter, small and perfect and unmistakably theirs, she wept with a joy so profound it bordered on pain. "She's beautiful," Caleb breathed, his finger gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. "She's perfect." "She looks like my mother," Maylene said wonderingly, seeing echoes of the woman who'd taught her everything in her daughter's delicate features. "She has her nose, her chin. Then she'll be both beautiful and wise," Caleb said. They named her Lily May Hawthorne, Lily for the new life blooming in this western valley, May to honor the grandmother she'd never meet but whose legacy lived on through her daughter's healing hands. The ranch celebrated with a feast that lasted well into the night. Pete whittled tiny animals for the baby. The ranch hands presented a hand-stitched quilt made from scraps of their own shirts. Rebecca declared herself Lily's official protector. Thomas wanted to know when the baby would be old enough to play. And Maylene, watching her daughter sleep in the beautiful cradle Caleb had made, felt the last chains of her past finally fall away. She'd been sold as unwanted. She'd been told she was worthless, shameful, a burden. She'd been blamed for her mother's death and treated as less than human by her own father. But she'd survived. More than survived. She'd thrived. She'd taken the knowledge her mother gave her and used it to save lives. She'd found a man who valued her strength instead of fearing it. She'd built a family based on choice and love instead of obligation and control. And now she held in her arms the future, a daughter who would grow up knowing she was wanted, valued, cherished, A daughter who would learn healing from her mother, just as Maylene had learned from hers, but without the shadow of shame or fear. A daughter who would understand that worth wasn't determined by gender or race or circumstances of birth, but by the content of one's character and the choices one made. In the quiet of that June night, with her daughter asleep in her arms and her husband beside her, Maylene Hawthorne understood that she'd done more than escape her father's cruelty or survive being sold. She'd transformed her pain into purpose, her suffering into strength, her loss into the foundation of something beautiful and lasting. The valley that had once seemed foreign had become her true home. The people who'd once been strangers had become her family. And the girl who'd been told she was unwanted had become a healer, a wife, a mother, a woman who knew her own worth and wouldn't let anyone tell her otherwise. As dawn broke over the Wyoming hills, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, Maylene whispered a promise to her sleeping daughter. "You will never doubt that you're loved. You will never feel unwanted. You will grow up strong and free and capable of anything you dream, and you will know every single day of your life that you are precious exactly as you are." Lily stirred in her sleep, one tiny fist curling against Maylene's chest, right over her heart. And in that perfect moment, Maylene knew that every hardship she'd endured, every tear she'd shed, every moment of fear and pain and uncertainty had been worth it to arrive at this place, this life, this profound and precious love. She'd been the daughter no one wanted, but she'd become the woman everyone needed. And most importantly, she'd become the woman she'd always had the potential to be. Strong, compassionate, valued, and finally, completely free. The harsh frontier had tested her, but it hadn't broken her. Instead, it had given her the space to discover who she truly was beneath the layers of shame and fear her father had wrapped around her. And what she'd discovered was this: she was enough. She'd always been enough. She just needed to find the right place and the right people to help her see it. As the sun rose fully over Hawthorne Ranch, Maylene closed her eyes and felt nothing but gratitude. For her mother's teachings, for Caleb's patience, for Sarah's friendship, for every patient she'd healed and every person who'd shown her that belonging was possible. But most of all, for the courage she'd found to choose hope over fear, love over bitterness, and freedom over the comfortable prison of believing she was worthless. She'd been sold for horses and flour, but she'd bought herself back with knowledge and skill and unwavering determination to be more than what others said she could be. And in doing so, she'd proven that the daughter no one wanted had become the woman everyone valued, including, finally and most importantly, herself.